Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online series for the Outdoor Explorer here at Contra Costa County Library. We're happy to have you here with us this evening. My name is Cara. I work at the Kensington branch. The Contra Costa County Library connects you with resources, services, and materials at 26 different library locations. Visit any library to use our public computers, printers, and free Wi-Fi. You can also visit one of our branches with laptops for on-site use or check out a Wi-Fi hotspot for 3 weeks. Project Second Chance is Contra Costa County Library's adult literacy program that trains and supports volunteer tutors to deliver basic literacy instruction to adults throughout the county. Visit your local branch or our website to learn more about becoming a volunteer or a student. At the library, you can access more than 1 million physical items, such as books, including international language collections, plus thousands of digital materials 24/7 at ccclib.org. And here you can see just a small sample of the kinds of digital resources available to you all for free. Okay, and welcome everyone to Outdoor Explorer online program series. Tonight's program is Living with Wildlife with Peter Alagona. By attending today's program, you have the opportunity to enter a drawing to win one of 3 vintage-inspired classic wool blankets tonight. After the program ends, your internet browser will show you a brief survey which will allow you to type your name and email address to be entered into the drawing. Winners will be notified by email and will coordinate sending the prize to your local library branch. If you have questions during tonight's talk, please type them into the Q&A tab, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At the end of the presentation, I will pose some of the questions to our speaker, Peter Alagona. So Peter is an environmental historian, conservation scientist, nature culture geographer, and professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, Cara.
Hello, welcome. I will hand over the presentation to you.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Go ahead and play. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, I see your slides.
Okay, fantastic. So first of all, I just want to thank Cara and the Contra Costa County Library System for hosting me here and for doing this amazing work that you are doing in the community, providing these amazing services. This Outdoor Explorer series is wonderful. I've seen some of the other coming events, and it's a really fantastic resource, and it's really kind of right up my alley. So today I want to tell you a little bit. So let me start back here. I want to tell you a little bit about this book on the left, this book called The Accidental Ecosystem, which I started way back in 2016-ish. And came out through the University of California Press just last year. So this is a relatively new completion for me, and it was a really fun project. And I'll tell you kind of about how I got into it, what it's about, and what I think some of the takeaway messages are about this really fascinating topic of urban wildlife. Before I do that, I'll just say a little bit maybe about what I do. I am, as Cara said, an environmental historian. I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara. And my work explores really what happens when humans share space and resources, which we call their habitats, with other species. And we do that all the time in all sorts of different ways. Oftentimes, we're not even really entirely aware of what we're doing, that we're sharing our space and resources with other creatures, but we do in all sorts of really interesting and complex ways. And this involves a lot of different aspects: how we interact with non-human creatures directly, how we make sense of these interactions with wildlife, why we sometimes fight so much about them. There's a lot of controversy about how we should live with wildlife, how we should manage it, how we should treat wild creatures, what we can learn from them by observing them and trying to live with them in our communities, and then how we might use these lessons to foster a more just, peaceful, humane, and sustainable society. Environmental history is the study of human relations with nature and our environments over time. And so I take a broadly historical perspective, but I do biological field work, ecological work. I also have a degree in geography, and I do lots of really enriching collaborations with colleagues at my home campus and other institutions, including ecologists, geographers, political scientists, education scholars, paleontologists, and many others who help me to understand this work and bring it to you in the form like the accidental ecosystem. So I really got started on this back in 2015, 2016. And the reason was that I had spent the first part of my career in graduate school, working on the dissertation, the PhD, and then later on a first book, studying endangered species in California and the West. And endangered species conservation is a really challenging and difficult topic, not just because many species have declined and are in danger of extinction, but also because the debates that surround them are often so divisive. And so when you study endangered species, whether you're just focusing on a particular creature today, or whether you're studying the history of endangered species conservation, like I was during the 2000s and early 2010s, you end up telling a lot of stories about loss and conflict. But by around 2015 or 2016, I was really looking for something different, to continue focusing on these complex and fascinating relationships between people and wild creatures, but hopefully to do so in a more positive and proactive way that would enable me to use history to help address these mounting challenges that are facing people and nature alike. This funny photo right here is a photo of a brown bear, what we call in most of North America a grizzly bear. And as I mentioned to Kara before we came online here this evening, one of my other favorite projects has to do with grizzly bears in California. And so really over these past several years, I've been focusing on these two things. A project looking at the past and even potential future of grizzly bears in California. That's an ongoing project. I'm actually working on a book about that right now. And so that's on your right. And on your left, this investigation of urban wildlife that turned into this book, The Accidental Ecosystem. And so that's what I'm going to spend about the next 20 or 25 minutes talking about. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the very end of the book for you, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion, because I know this is a topic that often raises a lot of questions for a lot of folks who live with wildlife in their neighborhoods and communities. So this project, this book, really began for me with an observation. Since World War II, cities in North America, but also many other parts of the world, including parts of South America, parts of Europe, East Asia, and elsewhere, have attracted unprecedented numbers of wildlife. Cities, urban areas, some of the biggest urban areas in the world, unprecedented numbers of wildlife. Almost every US city, in fact, now has more wildlife living in it than just about any time probably in at least the past 150 years. Now that timeline varies from place to place, depending on the age of the city, where it's located, the kinds of wildlife that are there, the geography of the region, the ecology. But overall, it's this kind of remarkable trend. Almost every US city now has more wildlife in it than at any time in the past 150 years. That's something that was not predicted based on the state-of-the-art ecological science of just a few decades ago. And it's something that ecologists, conservation biologists, and environmental historians like me are really still trying to make sense of now. How did this happen? How did we get to this place? And really, what does it mean? So this led me to these questions that really animate this book, and that I want to talk a little bit about and try to answer in some way tonight. How have cities, the most artificial and human-dominated of all Earth's ecosystems, grown rich with wildlife, even as wildlife has faded from so many more natural-seeming ecosystems throughout the rest of the world. And what does this paradox mean for cities, people, wildlife, and nature on our increasingly urban planet? So those are the driving questions behind this book, the ones that I spent 6 or 7 years trying to answer. Before I move on to the next slide, I want to point out that I'm going to be showing you a bunch of images tonight, but you're going to see a pattern. A number of them are these beautiful pen and ink drawings, like the kind of funny cartoonish one on the right with Coyote in Chicago. And oops, it's like I have something came up on the screen here. Cara? Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I got a prompt that came up on the screen. These images on the right are from this wonderful artist named Jane Kim, who's based at Inkwell Studio. That's her outfit. They're based in Half Moon Bay, and it's just this wonderful series of drawings that try to bring to life some of the animal characters in the book. So you can look out for those. Okay. So what did I do to try to answer these questions? Well, starting in about 2016, so within a year after kind of starting to really think about this topic and notice some of these trends and read about them, I spent 5 years conducting field and archival research to better understand how this has happened. Why have cities attracted so much wildlife? Why did almost nobody predict this decades ago? And what does it mean that now more than 80% of Americans who live in urban areas also now inhabit rich, diverse, novel, and often slightly weird multi-species communities? Based on the last US Census from 2020, something like 82% of Americans live in urban areas of many different kinds around the country. And these areas, cities have long been considered by philosophers from Plato to Voltaire to Jane Jacobs throughout the history of Western philosophy, really, have been really considered places for people. Cities are places for people. But now we live in urban areas that are actually rich ecosystems in some ways. And so making sense of what that means is a great challenge and also a fascinating path for me. So before I tell you what I learned in trying to answer these questions, I want to just start with 3 kind of caveats or notes of caution. So the first is, we tend to throw around a lot of terms like urban and wildlife, but it's important to define them. If you are an ecologist or a geographer, a demographer trying to understand the urban areas from like a statistical perspective, what kinds of people live there, how many, what kinds of animals, what kinds of habitats do they use? Then you need to be able to have a clear definition of what an urban area is and draw lines around it on the map so that you can collect the data and do the statistics. From the perspective of an environmental historian like me, though, the term urban is a lot slipperier. And there are 2 real reasons for that. One is that the definition of what an urban area has changed over time. If you look, for example, of how the US Census Bureau has defined urban areas, it has changed over the course of many decades. And so that's a complicating factor in trying to understand the data on urban areas in the United States. And then the second thing is that there are lots of areas that are kind of partly urban or mostly urban. And so seen from the perspective, not just of a statistician or a geographer or an ecologist or a demographer, but seen from the perspective of a wild animal, it's better to think of urban areas not as something specific and then there are rural areas and wildland areas, but rather as a kind of continuum, going from areas that are more rural to more suburban to much more urban, that present different opportunities and challenges for the wild creatures that live in them. The second kind of caveat that I want to mention is that only certain kinds of creatures thrive in cities. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in just a few minutes, so sit tight on that. But I want to mention it now because when folks talk about urban wildlife, there are many other people, conservationists, naturalists, ecologists, others out there in the world who say, wait a minute, talking about urban wildlife really kind of draws our attention away from the creatures that really need our help, most of which live in dwindling natural habitats. And so I want to make the point that talking about why some creatures thrive in cities is not to say that many other creatures are not in trouble. In fact, many are. And one of the motivating factors behind this project for me was really to try to understand why during an era of ecological decline, biodiversity loss globally, the decline and loss of wildlife in so many regions, why in some cities wildlife seems to be booming, or at least certain kinds of creatures are doing really well. And so that's kind of a paradox. And I just want to mention that as a note of caution here. And the final thing I want to say is that even though I'm going to be talking about a lot of broad trends tonight, there's a lot we don't know, and there's actually quite a bit we may never know. And the reason for that is that it is pretty recent. It's a recent phenomenon that ecologists and conservationists are studying wildlife in urban areas. For most of the history of ecology as a field, which is about 100 years or so old, and certainly most of the history of conservation biology, which is a younger field, most folks who worked in those areas didn't really want to work in cities. They weren't interested. They thought cities were boring and destructive. And it was only much later, really not until the 90s or even the 2000s, that people started really looking at cities from an ecological perspective and seeing things that they didn't expect to see. The result of this is that for many kinds of creatures living in American cities today, we just don't have the kinds of historical data that we would want to have in order to really understand in a fine-grained way how their populations have changed over time and how they have adapted to these places. There's one exception to that, one group of animals that's an exception, and that is birds. And the reason birds are an exception is that people have been bird watching, recreationally bird watching in urban areas for a very long time, really since urban areas emerged in the United States, and certainly since the late 19th centuries. And so we actually have a lot of information on bird populations in cities, but much, much less on populations of mammals, reptiles, fishes, of amphibians, certainly of insects and others. Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to tell you how I think we got to this point that we're at now, that I've just been describing for the past few minutes. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think it means. And then I'm going to read a short excerpt out of the book. Okay, so I think I've got 5 points here on how we got to this point where we have unexpectedly so much wildlife in so many of the communities where you and I live, certainly in places like California. Okay, so first, American cities, fascinatingly, were built on unusually rich areas. If you look at biological diversity on a continental scale, you'll see that the biggest, most prosperous American cities, particularly the top 10, but also, let's say, the top 50 today, many of them were built in areas that were unusually biologically diverse and productive compared to their surrounding regions. Now, these places, these ecosystems that grew into many of our biggest cities in North America, lost much of their native wildlife early on. But they exist in places that, if given the chance, many wild creatures would return to over time. So we built many of our biggest and most prosperous cities in areas that were hotspots of biological diversity before the city emerged. And so here's a map that you can see that I drew using a few different sources of data that shows the 50 largest cities in the United States. The bigger dots are the top 10, the smaller dots are 11 through 50. And it's overlaid on a map with two other simple forms of data. So one is that the thin squiggly lines in the background represent biological diversity from low, where there are no squiggly lines, to higher, where the squiggly lines become orange or even red. And so if you look at this, what you see is that in places like California in particular, but in some other parts of the country, like parts of Texas, Florida, and elsewhere, you see cities popping up, big cities in places where there's a lot of biological diversity. California is probably the best example of that. The big arrows indicate the general pathways for migratory bird flyways in North America. And the migratory bird flyways go right through many of our biggest cities. And so there are reasons for this. Big cities tended to first emerge in places where there were prosperous indigenous populations. They were there oftentimes because those were the best spots for fish and game, for water resources, for others. They tend to be located at the juxtaposition of two different kinds of ecosystems, so you can harvest or capture different kinds of resources, like along mountain ranges or seaboards. They tend to be also located in areas that are easy to access for transportation, so along river corridors or near major lake basins, or safe harbors that also have diverse ecosystems surrounding them. And so one of the reasons we ended up with so much wildlife in so many American cities today is because those are places, we built our cities in those places where wildlife naturally congregates and has done so in many cases for thousands of years. Okay, second. So over time, cities, many of our biggest cities, and these are really images largely from New York City, or renditions largely from New York City, went through this pattern of going from areas that were extremely biologically diverse, like I just mentioned, and had prosperous indigenous communities living on them, to areas, to growing Victorian cities that had lost most of their native wildlife, had been kind of driven out or hunted to extinction, but then were filled up with large numbers of domesticated animals, farm animals, in many cases. So we had a lot of horses and cows and pigs, and lots of feral cats and dogs and others living in cities, particularly in the 19th century. And during this time, also, there were many areas, many parts of cities that became very denuded, very polluted. There were very few laws limiting water pollution, for example, what you could do along the coastline, what you could dump into rivers and streams. And so many areas looked pretty bad in many cities by the end of the 19th century. And then later on, of course, the development of urban parks, of tree planting programs, environmental laws designed to clean up air and waterways. And so you see a transition in cities from places that could house a lot of wildlife to places that probably couldn't house a lot of wildlife, and then back to places where potentially wildlife could return. And I want to point out in this in particular, so on the top left, we have an artist's rendition of what Manhattan Island might have looked like many hundreds of years ago. On the top right, you have this kind of Victorian image of the barnyard city with lots of domesticated animals, including in particular lots of horses in it. On the bottom left, that's a picture of Central Park in New York City prior to the development of the park and the kind of condition that the parkland was in. And then in the bottom right, you have a modern picture of Central Park, this kind of leafy urban garden that can host a lot of wildlife as long as animals can traverse the urban landscape to get there. Excuse me. A third point in how we got here is that social changes, including the rise of conservation, suburban growth, and the decline of hunting as a pastime in many areas, enabled wildlife populations to bounce back in urban areas. And so it wasn't just changes in the landscape, it was changes in society, including increasing tolerance for some creatures that people had not tolerated living in their communities earlier, including endangered species programs like the ones that helped bring back the American alligator there on the top left, using that crosswalk there in Florida. Efforts to protect migratory birds, black-crowned night heron, example of that on the bottom left there, and also tree planting programs aimed really to provide healthier environments for people to create more cohesive and stable kind of social relations in cities that ended up enabling creatures like eastern gray squirrels that had been eliminated from many eastern cities to return to them after years of tree planting and increasingly leafy urban environments. We can't discount the role of popular culture, which has also played a crucial role. Media depictions of wild animals, including the 1942 Disney classic Bambi, helped foster a broad shift from what social scientists call dominance over nature values to more mutualistic, so coexistence with nature, wildlife values. And I want to make a point in particular about Bambi. In the movie Bambi, 1942, this is actually the time really after World War II when wildlife starts to return to cities. So Bambi comes along just really at the cusp of this, and is an incredibly important film that really set the stage for a lot of later wildlife TV shows and films that came afterward, including many of the ones that are on cable television and the internet today. But if you remember the classic line from Bambi, the great prince of the forest, Bambi's father says, it is man, we must go deep into the forest. And so he's talking to this cast of animals. And if you look at that cast of characters there in this image on the screen, what do you see? You see white-tailed deer, you see possums, you see skunks, you see raccoons, you see cottontails, you see squirrels. Okay, so this is the cast of characters that in 1942, Disney was advising had to go deep into the forest to get away from man. And this was really more about World War II and what was happening at the time in Europe. But the fascinating thing about this is that within a few decades, this entire cast of animals were among the first to start showing up in greater numbers in many suburban and urban areas throughout the United States. And so the skunks and raccoons and white-tailed deer, they basically did exactly the opposite of what Disney and the Great Prince of the Forest warned them, admonished them to do. They actually started thriving in more urbanized regions, as well as in more forested areas in places like the American Northeast. And then this point that I made earlier, that this all came as a surprise to many wildlife scientists. And it's not just because they weren't looking in urban areas decades ago. That's true, but it's not just because of that. It's also because when they did look, they tended to undercount wildlife populations, and they also underestimated the flexibility, what many people call the adaptability of many species. We have animals like black bears in this country now living in places that black bear biologists in the mid-20th century would never have imagined that black bears could have lived. And so this has posed a lot of challenges for people in those communities living with some of those creatures. But I think it's a real lesson that many of us want to take on board, that you should never underestimate a bear, but you should probably never underestimate a wild creature in general, because if you do, it will often surprise you. So what are the kinds of creatures, these kinds of creatures that have come back to these places? Well, there are really, we can talk about this in terms of three groups of animals. This is a kind of simplified way of thinking about it, but it's useful, I think, at least as a starting point. The urban exploiters are creatures like pigeons that do really well in many urban areas, not just in the United States, but around the world. They're very comfortable there. And as a matter of fact, they're the kinds of creatures that you might not see in wilderness areas almost anywhere today. Urban adapters, like raccoons, are creatures that can do quite well in urban areas, but often require some kind of green space. So maybe if there's a leafy green park that they can retreat to and hide in during the day and then come out at night to forage, they commute back and forth between those spaces, just like people. Those are the urban adapters. And then there are the urban avoiders, the creatures that you are unlikely to ever see in an urban environment. And if you do, it's probably not that great of a situation for them or anybody else. And so wolves and wolverines are examples of that. There are always exceptions, though, and our recently departed friend P22, the mountain lion of Griffith Park in Los Angeles, is kind of an exception. So, but if you look at the urban exploiters like the pigeons, what are some characteristics that urban exploiters, some kinds of rats, pigeons, crows, have in common? They tend to be social, meaning they can tolerate being around large numbers of their own kind. They tend to raise their young and teach their young lessons that they have learned, passing on lessons. They tend to be experimental, meaning that they're willing to try new things like new foods or new ways of accessing foods. They tend to be behaviorally flexible, meaning they can behave different ways in different environments. So they're not very rigid in their behavior. And they also tend to be omnivorous, and this is related to the rest of the stuff. But here we go. What I often say when people are wondering about this is I say, if you add all these up together, social, parental, experimental, flexible, omnivorous, what does that sound like? That sounds like a human being. And I know that you didn't come to this talk tonight to hear that human beings are a lot like rats and pigeons, but we share some of these same basic biological characteristics. And that's one of the reasons that we can both live in such great numbers in these artificial habitats that we've created. Okay, so what does this all mean? Now I'm going to go through and just give you some thoughts about what I think this means and where we're headed. Then I'll read that brief excerpt. So one thing I learned from writing this book is that nowadays almost everyone who lives in a city has an urban wildlife story, yet these stories usually say more about the people who tell them than they do about the animals they claim to describe. Every time I told someone when I was working on this book that I was writing about urban wildlife, either they asked me, one, so you're studying rats and pigeons, or they told me some surprising urban wildlife story of their own. These are some images from early in the pandemic that went viral online of supposedly dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, swimming in crystal clear Venice canals. These turned out to be hoaxes, they were fakes. But the fact that people chose to circulate this, the fact that people passed it along on social media, and that so many of us were so willing to believe this, I think says a lot about how we were prepared to see wildlife increasingly in urban areas, how we've been prepared to think that nature would take over at a kind of moment that might have seemed apocalyptic. Hollywood often tells us that. And that the things that we tend to think about wildlife actually reflects a lot of our own hopes and fears and desires. So there are a lot of problems in living with wild creatures in urban areas. I mean, they pose important questions and they pose challenges, and these things are real. But they're also frequently exaggerated by mass and social media, which tends to focus on kind of ironies and isolated incidents and short-term costs, rather than complicated relationships, solutions, opportunities, and the long-term benefits of living in diverse multi-species communities. And there are many long-term benefits. So what are some of these benefits that have been borne out in scholarly research published in peer-reviewed journals of living in communities with wildlife, surrounded by wildlife? Well, pollination. If you like gardens, if you like plants, if you like food, pollination is good. Healthy insect pollinators and bird pollinating populations are important. Pest control. Bats, this is an image of bats along the Congress Avenue Bridge in Boston. Bats are amazing. They get blamed for spreading disease, and there are reasons for that, but they're also amazing at controlling populations of mosquitoes and other insect pests. Disease dilution, that's a complicated thing, but in some systems, it seems true that if you have healthy, diverse ecosystems with lots of different kinds of animals, including larger predators, then you're likely to see a decreased likelihood of disease transmission, infectious diseases. Public health sentinels, when you find a sick animal, it brings up questions about what's in the environment, what could be passed on to other animals or even people. Mental health benefits of seeing wild creatures, childhood development. I have an 11-year-old son, and being able to see and interact with wildlife is the beginning of many wonderful conversations and learning experiences. Science and education, benefits for urban planning when you protect areas for wildlife. You can see multiple different kinds of compatible benefits. Serendipitous encounters, a sense of perspective, and just this active storytelling that I was talking about just a few minutes ago. So urban wildlife, I want to say, because this question often comes up, does not really benefit from, at least in the long term, from some of the urbanization processes that are really affecting many of our cities in ways that are increasing social inequality. So gentrification, NIMBYism, and other extractive or exclusionary economic agendas. It's not that foxes do well in fancy urban parks next to the Whole Foods parking lot. It's that foxes are adaptable, at least red foxes and gray foxes are adaptable species that can live in semi-urban or adjacent urban areas and benefit in a lot of ways if people will permit them to do so. And so what do wildlife species actually benefit from in cities? They benefit from robust civic investments, such as pollution abatement, clean water initiatives, river restoration, tree planting, these sorts of things, strong social ties, and support systems such as high quality education, housing, and sanitation, all of which affect in many, many ways the creatures that live in those communities. The difference between well-managed sanitation and particularly food waste and poorly managed sanitation has direct effects on wildlife, and it's often a symptom of civic investments, social ties, social inequality, and these sorts of issues in urban areas. I think it's amazing just to see how many really cool projects are getting implemented now to try to protect wildlife in and around urban areas. One of the most high profile of these is the Wallace-Annenberg crossing that's now under construction across the 101 freeway in the Conejo Valley, Calabasas region, just northwest of Los Angeles, to provide connectivity for wildlife to cross between the Santa Monica Mountains and the Santa Susana Mountains and Los Padres National Forest further north. This is primarily to protect mountain lions, but it includes many other species. And there are many cities that are investing in these kinds of things, or finding that protecting natural areas that benefit wildlife also benefits the community and the people in it, including the bottom line sometimes, in really tangible ways. And so for me, it's been inspiring over the course of working on this book and reflecting on it to see these amazing projects popping up all over the country in extremely diverse regions, not just in places like California. And then the final point here about what it all means is that one of the greatest wildlife transformations since the dawn of conservation happened mostly by accident. You know, the reason we have an accidental ecosystem is because people did things to improve urban areas for people, and then those things ended up helping wildlife. Yet bringing creatures back to our cities was actually really the easy part. The challenging part is living with them now that we're here, and doing so means fostering a more just, humane, sustainable, and intentional, not accidental, intentional urban ecosystem. So now what I want to do is I want to just read for a minute here a brief excerpt from the end of my book. And so this is in the coda of the book, starting on page 212, and it's about this nest. And so I'm going to tell you the story of this nest sitting on my old kitchen table there. And while I'm reading it, you can just kind of check it out. And after I'm done with this, then we can open it up for questions. So this is now the beginning of the pandemic, and so I start here. A few weeks later, I received a text from a friend. "Come down to Shoreline Park," she wrote. "I found something you need to see." And keep in mind, this is in Santa Barbara. I was at home feeling a little sorry for myself. My first outing since the lockdown began, a hike in the Los Padres National Forest, had ended with a hurt back and a sore ego. My friend assured me that what she found would raise my spirits. "I'm near the picnic tables by the beach," she said. "Get over here." An hour later, we were standing on a patch of brown grass next to a clump of scruffy bushes at the base of a palm tree a few feet from the sand. It was muggy outside, and through my surgical mask, I could smell the restroom on the far side of the parking lot. My spirits were not yet raised. "Look in the bushes," my friend said. I bent over with a groan. Nothing. "Look again," she said. Nothing. "Look again." Then it came into view. I reached down and gently scooped up the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. This nest. I had read many accounts of objects just like it, but now that I was holding one in my hand, I realized that I hadn't really understood what I'd read, what it meant, how it felt. I was holding a common cup nest of the kind built each spring by robins, warblers, and hummingbirds. It appeared to have fallen out of that palm tree. But this was different than the nests I'd seen in my field guides or up in the Los Padres. In the scientific literature I'd studied that described urban nests didn't come close to doing justice to this dazzling piece of contemporary architecture. The next day, I sat down at my kitchen table to catalog the materials the nest contained. There were needles from Italian stone pines, fibers from the trunks of Canary Island date palms, and twigs from Australian eucalyptus trees, as well as lichens, feathers, and grasses from species native to Europe and Asia. The nest also contained brown wool, blue string, and yarn in purple, orange, yellow, white, and black. I found scraps of napkins and paper towels, along with several cigarette butts, which have antimicrobial properties that may deter some nest parasites. There was aluminum foil and a swatch of gray stitched nylon that looked like it had once been part of a tent. There were half a dozen straw sleeves, both paper and plastic, and the kind of synthetic filling used to stuff pillows. The tinsel was a nice touch. When it finally dawned on me, I was glad to be sitting down. This gorgeous nest, This postmodern collage in the form of a cradle said more about urban ecosystems and wildlife than the book I've been writing for the previous 5 years. Yes, this book. Judging by the nest's size, shape, and location, its most likely architect was an American robin. Robins are North America's fourth most common bird, after red-winged blackbirds, European starlings, and house finches. Because robins subsist on a diverse omnivorous diet, can live in almost any region with woods and fields, and seem at home around people, they're well suited for city life. Since robins consume large numbers of ground-dwelling invertebrates like earthworms, some scientists also consider them useful indicators of soil and water quality. Yet despite these admirable traits, and the nursery rhyme that helped make them famous, little robin redbreast sat upon a rail and it'll noodle when its head wiggle waggle on its tail, robins don't get much respect. Even their Latin name, Turdus migratorius, seems a little passive-aggressive. Yet to behold an urban robin's nest, its design, its structure, its function, its whimsy, is to be reminded that in nature nothing goes to waste. It's also to be reminded that some human-made waste may never completely disappear. Robins may be building nests with our garbage long after Homo sapiens have gone the way of the dodo. So with that, I'd like to, I guess, hand it over to Kara, and maybe we can take some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, we have some questions here in the Q&A feature. And just for those of you who joined us during the program, down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A option. So if you have some thoughts you want to share or a question you want to ask Peter, go ahead and drop it into that. And I will read some of these questions that we got during the presentation. Okay. So the first question is, how do you study how many and which animals lived in cities in the past?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's really important because in many cases, people didn't study which animals lived in cities in the past. And so as a result, for many creatures, we have very little data. For some, we have good data, but it's only maybe a decade or 2 or 3 old. And so this is a limiting factor in trying to understand statistically how these populations have changed over time. But there are exceptions to this, and from those exceptions we can extrapolate. We can also use archival sources like journals, like old newspapers with reports in them, letters, correspondence, some academic journal articles as well, and others, to try to piece together little observations that give us a broader picture. The one group of species that I mentioned earlier, for which we do have really pretty good data about population trends in the past, is with birds in urban areas. Bird watchers have been writing down the birds that they see in urban areas for a very long time. But then in the early part of the 20th century, a group of conservationists based in New York City were trying to figure out a way to convince people to stop shooting birds and start looking at them and enjoying them alive. And so one of the things they did, a guy named Frank Chapman was actually at the head of this movement, is to come up with this idea of the Audubon Christmas bird count. And so what they did is they organized birders to go out there and in groups around Christmas time, families, church groups, others, bird watchers, to go out and to record the birds that they saw and then contribute them to a central database. This grew over time into what is now almost without a doubt the world's largest, most robust, and longest running community science, what we used to sort of call citizen science, community science, a project of people contributing to the body of scientific knowledge. And so to answer your question, for many species, we wish we knew more. You can sometimes be creative in some ways at looking at other forms of data and learn things that come together into a bigger picture. But the group that we really know by far the most about are those birds. And that's because so many people have loved birds for so long.
I like that. Put down your gun and pick up your pencil.
Uh, doesn't the Outdoor Explorer program have a bird watching related event coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. We have Bob Lewis, who is a bird watcher and an educator. He's been doing a number of programs for us through this series. And the next one, just looking at my list over here, the next one is in April, and he's going to be talking about birds of the Sierra Valley.
Oh,
And he's great. If anyone is interested in birds, I absolutely recommend his program. So please join us. Okay, next question. When researching the increase of wildlife in cities, how important is it to track invasive non-native species versus native species? Or are these factors important only for open spaces and non-urban environments?
ooh, that is a fantastic question. Another great question. These are really at the heart of this. I I had a series of debates and arguments with a number of people as I was working on this book about that exact question. People who do this for a living, conservationists, scientists, even the editors of this book had a bit of a debate about this topic. And so where I ended up coming down on it is this. I am a great believer in doing everything we can to conserve native species because doing so conserves the diversity of our natural world and really maintains the kind of heritage, the shared natural and cultural heritage of different regions. If we want, for example, to uphold and to celebrate indigenous culture and history in California, we need to be able to preserve native species and landscapes and ecosystems, which were cultivated in many cases by people who lived on this landscape for a very long time. Having said that, I think it is clear that urban ecosystems qualify as what scientists sometimes now call novel ecosystems. A novel ecosystem is an ecosystem that is, like its name says, new, that has not been around very long in the scope of ecological and evolutionary history. And so the result is that there are not many species that are truly adapted in any significant long-term evolutionary way to the environments we are presenting them with today in cities. Some of them have adapted a little bit, not enormously, but a little bit. We have a lot of examples of that now. I have a whole chapter on it in the book. But many of them are succeeding. The ones that are succeeding in cities are doing so because they have some other trait that adapted in a natural landscape that's then been transferred in some serendipitous, successful way into an urban area. So we have novel ecosystems in which exotic species and native species are living side by side. What I say in the book is that if you focus really on trying to get rid of the exotics in novel ecosystems, then you're kind of on a little bit of a slippery slope because the sort of language that is often used to protect or to eradicate exotic species is language that's also charged language that's sometimes used in kind of the worst moments of our immigration debates in this country, and it actually has been that way for more than 100 years now. And so instead of judging a plant or animal on the place in which its ancestors emerged, what I sort of say is that in an ecosystem like a city, what we should be judging them on is what they're actually doing there, right? So what are they doing there? Is it a non-native species that also happens to grow in aquatic environments in a way that it filters pollution? If so, then we might want to think about, looking on it a little bit more favorably. Maybe it's a native species that for some reason in an urban environment became kind of like a pest. We have pocket gophers in California that are like that. And so thinking about the roles that these animals are playing, what they're actually doing, and how we are enabling that through the way that we are creating and maintaining urban habitats, that's really the most important thing. And then so you get to the point, once you do that, then you say, okay, well, what kind of a urban ecosystem do we want? Maybe we want an urban ecosystem with fewer rats. That's a reasonable thing to say. Well, maybe your answer to having fewer rats is having more owls. That's something you can actually do, right? You can create a habitat that fosters owls And when you have more owls around, you tend to lose a number of rats each night, right? The population goes down over time, and I've seen that in my own communities here in Santa Barbara after having watched a pair of great horned owls raise chicks and fledged chicks from a Canary Island date palm tree across the street a few years back. And so, to sum this all up, I'll just say that exotic and native species designations are important in some contexts. In urban areas, I think we should focus much more on what plants and animals are actually doing.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a couple questions about native plants, which I think you broadly address there. I'll also say to those folks interested in learning more about native species and native plants, there's another program happening at the library in conjunction with the UC Master Gardeners. They do all sorts of wonderful webinars and seminars and topics, and a lot of it is native plant oriented. So if you want to learn more about that, you can just call the library or check on our website, and there's ongoing native plant programs out there for you. Okay, another question for you, Peter. What factors go into determining where wildlife bridges or underpasses should be built?
Oh, that's a really great, really fun question. So we in the US, we're behind on this. We're behind the Canadians, we're behind the Europeans, but we're just starting to catch up. And so in California now, we have a law that was passed. Some great activists were able to get this through. I forget the bill designation of it, but it essentially requires Caltrans to at least think about, at least start to think about wildlife migratory pathways and related infrastructure with new highway projects. And so this was an enormous thing. So this is now suddenly we are poised in California with, if we have appropriate budgets and these sorts of things, to be able to really play catch up here in a way that is actually exciting, I think. And the Annenberg crossing on the 101 in LA County, that's the big, that's the big ticket, project. But my hope is that there'll be many others, and there's a real need for an even bigger one, in a sense, to cross the I-5 freeway over the Grapevine, connecting the Tehachapi Mountains in the east with the Los Padres National Forest in the west. And so, but there are many other much smaller sorts of infrastructure that's really important, including infrastructure that helps amphibians migrate in places like the East Bay and the peninsula. I think that the key thing about over and underpasses is this: they have to be built in the place that makes sense, right? So you have to have a really good understanding of the way in which wildlife is using the landscape from a landscape scale perspective to understand, okay, this is the area where it's really needed. And so there's been some really amazing research and experience now, 25 years of experience in Canada, in Alberta, in the Bow River Valley, which is where Canmore and Banff is, Rocky Mountains and Banff National Park there in Alberta, west of Calgary. And they were having a lot of roadkill around the national park on the Trans-Canada Highway, a very important route, the major route through east-west route across the country. And so the idea of overpasses was initially discussed in the 1980s. A lot of people said it wouldn't work, but they were able to figure out where wildlife was crossing the highway, at what times of year, what kinds of infrastructure would be most conducive for them to pass through. So fencing along the highway, leading to naturalistic, naturally landscaped under and overpasses. And they were able to then design a series of these strategically located, camouflaged, fenced in those areas along the highway throughout the valley. There are now a few dozen of them, I think. And they were able to reduce the amount of roadkill in that region along the Trans-Canada Highway. And when I say roadkill, I mean everything: moose, elk, grizzly bears, by over 90%.
Wow.
And so this is an enormous benefit for wildlife, and it's a huge traffic safety issue for motorists going through that region. People were dying on that road, and they're not anymore, from at least as a result of that kind of a situation. And so we, I guess what I'll say is that as we enter, hopefully, what is a new phase of investing in our infrastructure in a way so that it has less of a detrimental impact on our wildlife, that we have a lot of experience and data and expertise to draw from in some of these other regions. And so that's exciting to me. And I think that is one area in which I think California is showing signs of heading in the right direction.
That makes me think of hedgerows being recommended for farming as a way to help insect and bird life stay safe, sort of keep them from going out into roadways and getting hit by cars, and keeping that ecosystem, in the field.
But the hedgerows in many areas, like in the Great Plains and also in Europe, were also windbreaks, right? And
Yeah.
so they were there for farming purposes to prevent soil erosion. And so that's an example, I think, going back a long time, of the ways in which sometimes you can find these situations where thinking about infrastructure in creative ways that benefit people then have knock-on benefits for wildlife. Another classic example of that is in areas where cities have planned to back off their river corridors, leaving those areas as parkland and open space, crucially important as wildlife corridors, open to public use for 99% of the time. And then when it floods, people's people's homes and businesses aren't there to be damaged. And so that's just another kind of case where, cities that have managed to accomplish this in some areas are seeing a lot of benefits for people and for a host of other creatures.
Yes, absolutely. And there are a couple questions somewhat related to that. I'm going to sort of lump these all together. People are asking about coyotes, which are a big community that we interact with here in Contra Costa County. One person asks, is there any studies being done about animals in urban settings that are starting to interact with people? And there's another question about the controversy of coyotes preying on pets in urban areas. And, do you have any comments on coping with when those interactions become perhaps a little bit more dangerous or volatile, or just controversial?
So I would like to, so I think I have an opportunity for some shameless promotion here. So that's basically what this book's about. So there's a lot, there's a lot of that stuff in here. And, but I'm not going to really take credit for that in a way, because I'm fortunate in that the research, the scientific research on this topic has grown so much over the past 20 years. And so is there a lot of work being done in this area? Absolutely. I feel like I'm already falling behind in a way because it's moving really fast and people are doing a lot of really amazing studies to try to figure out this challenging puzzle of how do you coexist, right? So one thing I would love, if folks come away from this this discussion with one thing here, and I know this is going to sound a little weird, but here's what I would like it to be. It's that whenever you hear a story about an adverse incident with a wild animal, like a coyote attacks somebody's dog or bites somebody, there's almost always a backstory. And that backstory is rarely reported in the media. It turns out that that coyote that bit somebody, actually somebody was feeding it cat food for 6 months on their deck because they liked looking at it through their sliding glass doors. And then, the animal ended up becoming bold and aggressive and habituated to people and food conditioned and going around the neighborhood looking mean and tough and eventually biting somebody's dog. And so that's a classic kind of situation. When you hear these stories, I would urge you to remember that. And the reason I would urge you to remember that is not because, the animal is always innocent or weird things don't happen. But what that says is that if we are addressing these issues, but when they are already problems, when we've already created a problem, then we've already lost. It is, it's fairly easy to prevent a bear from getting somebody's peanut butter, you know, off of their picnic table. It's pretty easy to prevent that. But once it happens, once you eat peanut butter, are you ever going to go back? Probably not, you know? There's no going back after that. You've tasted it, you know what it is, you're going after it, right? And so the key is to prevent that to begin with. And we do that through education. We do that through better infrastructure, like better, trash cans, even like the most mundane things in the world, and food storage. We do that in some cases, unfortunately, through law enforcement, if folks are egregious about it, but I hope it doesn't come to that point. By designing urban areas that allow animals to pass through without necessarily having to be in the position of foraging in those ways. And so that's what I want to say about that. What I will say about coyotes is, if you're interested in coyotes, there is a fantastic book called Coyote America. If you hear in the background, that's not a coyote, that's my dog, Suki. There's a fantastic book called Coyote America by Dan Flores. It came out about 5 years ago or so. And it's really a deep look at the coyotes, history, biology, and everything else. And it's just an amazing resource on really understanding these animals, which are so amazing. I mean, Americans waged one of the most violent and drawn out campaigns in world history against a vertebrate animal, against coyotes, over the last 200 years on this continent. And how did coyotes respond to it? They responded to it by taking over the whole continent. They started in the Southwest and the Great Plains, and now they live in every US state except Alaska. They live in all Canadian provinces except a couple of the maritime islands. They're all the way down into the tropical forests of Central America now. And they've been able to do that by adapting to this rapidly changing human-dominated landscape. And so in a way, the reason they're around, the reason they're so successful is they've kind of figured us out.
And I did a quick search. We do have Coyote America here at the library. If anyone's interested, you can just search the catalog or give us a call. We can help you get a hold of a copy.
It's a great book.
It looks like a very good book. But we also, as part of the Outdoor Explorer series, we've been creating book lists, sort of compiling books on related topics to the talks that we have. So you can find that on our website. If you can't find it, you can email me directly. I'll help you out. But it's through the blog post, the Outdoor Explorer blog post. And I know we're running over, but there's one more question. If you have time, Peter. Okay. How do you think global warming will impact our shared ecosystem with animals?
Oh my gosh, what another great question. These are the best questions I've gotten in any talk about this book. So bravo to the Contra Costa County Library crew. So how do you even summarize that? Well, here's what I will say with regard to urban areas in particular. Urban areas have their own climates. And in some ways, those climates look more like a future kind of climate change scenario. In some ways, they look different. They often create patches of urban ecosystem that are really different than the surrounding region. And some species are able to take advantage of that in really interesting ways, and others are not. And so at the heart of that is really a process of sorting. So as humans transform the world, of course, cities, of course, but the entire world, really, we're sorting between animals that are winners and losers. And that's a kind of a sorting by luck process, because every creature out there is adapted to a historic ecosystem that wasn't, dominated by people. But some of them, like I said before, are lucky to have aspects of who they are, of what they are, that enable them to thrive in the Anthropocene in this 21st century. And so, I would say that there's a possibility in cities to serve as kind of even buffers for climate change. cities are in the desert, places like Phoenix and Las Vegas, the city is much wetter than the surrounding landscape. On the other hand, cities tend to be warmer than the surrounding regions. And that can have a whole bunch of different effects. The summertime heat can exclude certain kinds of animals, but for other kinds of creatures, the growing season can be a little bit longer. And the combination of a little bit longer growing season and a little bit more food can mean that they can reproduce at a greater rate. And so I'm not sure that there's one kind of lesson we can take away from us about how urban wildlife will respond to climate change. But if what's going on now is any indication, then I think that the creatures that are successful around people will be the ones that will continue to be the creatures that are successful around people. Kara, I can't quite hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
It's getting noisy here at the library, so I muted myself. So thank you, Peter, for being here with us tonight. And thanks to everyone at home for joining us this evening. If you joined late or missed any part of this talk, it is being recorded. Give us a few days and then it will be up on our library events page and our YouTube page. You can find it either way. We do have a number of programs in this series coming up. We have two in April, Birds of the Sierra Valley and ethical wildlife photography. Oh, as well as next month, we have Birding is for Everyone with John C. Robinson, who is an advocate for people of color in ornithology and just science in general. So hopefully you can join us for some of those. And once I close this webinar, you'll get the survey to register to possibly win a vintage inspired wool blanket. So thanks again, everybody. And thank you, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.